Good morning. This is Pastor Doug. Still going through our study on none of these diseases. We're in the 4th chapter, which our author here, S.I. McMillan, medical doctor from writing in 1963, says is the robber of 5 million brains. And what he's talking about in this chapter is a disease that we don't have to endure whenever we follow the Lord is alcoholism and all of its problems. Dr. McMillan starts out the chapter by repeating some sort of anecdotal problems. And it almost feels like those driver ed courses that you have to go through those horrific videos that just scare you to death about the possibility of dying in a car accident that's related to alcohol, whether you're the one driving or it's some other person who's under the influence and out there driving. He describes getting this call at midnight. The officers are on scene. 2 are dead, 2 are injured, and they want him to, of course, be helping with the injured and also confirming the death of the other 2. He describes it in detail, which I am not going to do, but it is an unforgettable experience for him. And it's something that happened fairly often throughout his career as a medical doctor. In fact, he talks about this one particular case, and he says even when one brain is robbed of its facilities and results in death, that's one too many. But he says it's not limited to one, but even back then, 5 million people, he said 5 billion brains, are robbed daily due to the abuse in drinking alcohol. He quotes the Journal of American Medical Association that actually used the phrase robber of 5 million brains. And in that, they relate an episode where a school bus driver was under the influence, and there were 26 terrified children that were on his bus, and each time he slows down, some of the kids bail out. It doesn't tell us which door they go out or how they get out, but they're scared to death trying to get out of this thing. He slows down enough where they can, and then he describes the end result of this driver in the crash that he gets into. He said that alcohol takes over a person's brain like a master takes control over a slave. Whether you like that image or not, that's the one that he used. And he said that each year there are 200,000 more slaves to alcohol. And he's talking about not just having a drink, but he is talking about being an alcoholic, a disease in which it takes over your mind and your thoughts and your whole person. And most of us probably have someone in our families or in our lives that we know that got to that point where it was in control. And fortunately, I've had the opportunity of talking with several people who are at that point and trying to help them move away from it. Certainly have my own family history with a family that have gotten to that point in their lives, and it caused havoc. It caused ruin. Just in regard to accidents on the highway, McMillan talks about a Delaware study that says half of all traffic accidents that end in death were related to alcohol. The New York State Department, along with the Cornell University at the time, 73% is what they came up with. In Westchester County in New York, they did one in which 83% of single accidents was related to it. And he kind of gets to the point using a euphemism to talk about alcohol as John Barleycorn. He says if we made this disease into a person and we made the connection that they were responsible for causing these deaths, what would we do to them? And he says, we don't even suspend the license. Of course, we warn people and we let them know what the potential problems can be, but we leave it to them to choose. He says in the defense of alcohol, some people often bring up the industry and the income that it generates. The liquor industry at that time, and he uses that term liquor probably a little derogatory because he's had this experience and seen such a horrific side of it, that their insurance could be lowered by 40%, was the guess, if the alcohol-related accidents were no longer a part of the equation. But they produce taxes when you buy that alcohol, and it is a big income for governments. And so, they're kind of liking that income of money, even though they are not liking the results of what happens when people are under the influence. He said there was a statistical study of violent deaths, so it goes beyond just driving, that in 27 years of autopsies in Middlesex County, New Jersey, 41% of them made those violent crimes that resulted in death because they were under the influence. The medical examiner at the time there said no other drug is more widely used nor more frequently responsible for deaths, injuries, and crimes. It even has an impact to play on suicides, which at that time was the 11th leading cause of death in the U.S., totaling more than 20,000 people each year, and said that alcohol was responsible for at least 25% of them. Then he goes on to talk about other ways that alcohol robs the brain, and he talked about people who really kind of went a little crazy. Talked about a particular person that's in the medical journals that saw the proverbial pink elephants and orange buffaloes and scarlet gorillas, and this man would end up breaking down and screaming for fear of his life, trying to escape those animals. He would do everything he could, breaking windows, trying to leap out of them. They had to handcuff him to his bed. They had to sedate him because he was in a state of delirium that was brought on by alcoholism. And there are a lot of crazy antics that get linked to how alcohol impacts the brain. It's disturbing to hear about it. We could probably have our own stories about it. But it's also, at least at that time, was becoming one of the most important factors in mental disease. And it made, at least at that time, mental disease being the number one problem that health professionals were trying to address. He said that 10% of all admissions into mental hospitals at that time, and a lot of times people weren't going to them as they do today, report that it was 10% were due to alcoholism. Another 10% where alcoholism was a contributing factor, so that's now 20%, and 6% were developed some form of insanity as a result of it, and so they were admitted for the insanity, but again, alcohol being the cause of it, so that's now 26%. The reason being is that alcohol leads to the atrophy of the brain. In other words, it is not good for what's going on inside your head. Alcohol, he said, is just a licensed robber. He quotes Shakespeare, which says, "Oh God, that men should put an enemy in their mouths to steal away their brains." It affects the rest of the body in other kinds of ways. It can lead to paralysis of certain muscles. Talk about some people who are getting up and they just no longer had use of an arm, and it's a known effect. There's neuritis, the inflammation of peripheral nerves that cause this paralysis or cause pain and loss of function. They talk about the hardening of the arteries. He goes into that to quite detail, and talk about the swelling with fluids and the effects on breathing, the ruptures of veins. It got pretty gory, so I'm not going to go any further in that as well. And he kind of gets the point. It says, for at least a doctor, and for the rest of it, it becomes a waste of young lives. Now, most of us who survived our childhood, our youth, in which we did not heed the warnings and certainly drank more alcohol than we should have been drinking, it's just by God's grace that we survived, that we didn't end up crippled, that we didn't end up dead, because of that alcohol in our system that took away our ability to reason, to evaluate, to respond. It really does rob your facilities. If you've had any experience with it all, you can't say, "Wow, no, it doesn't affect me." In fact, you might say, "Is there anyone that it doesn't affect?" A lot of people, "Well, it doesn't affect me. I can drink and get away with it." And I'm going like, "Well, no, it actually does affect you. You're just not aware of it," and that's often the problem. As you drink more and more, you don't realize it. You learn to function pretty well, and there are people who learn to function pretty darn well with it. But there is that point where that functioning no longer is able to keep up, and problems always ensue. Now, he gave a little anecdotal experience where he went out with some friends to celebrate New Year's Eve, and as is prone on New Year's Eve, there was a lot of heavy drinking. He and his wife didn't, but in the next morning they were out at evidently this very nice hotel where this party was held at. They had this amazing breakfast. He said he and his wife got up. They enjoyed the breakfast, but their friends spent the morning holding their heads and taking aspirin, couldn't eat even a bite of it, the food. And so he just makes the comment saying, "Man, actually life is a whole lot better without the supposed pleasure that alcohol brings." And then he makes a list of all the things that are better without alcohol. He says recreation, music, art, eating, sex, sight, conversation. He says it can cause all kinds of things, even for some people to the point that they can't even ingest food because of the inflammation and the problems it cause to the whole digestive tract. But he says that there are still people who hesitate to walk the Christian way because they just don't want to give up this pleasure of life. And so he quotes some scripture, which is what his whole point is that we follow what God calls us to do, we'll avoid these diseases. He says, "No good thing will be withheld from those who walk upright." It says, "Biblical regulations have been written so that man might obtain the greatest joy in life." When we follow God's ways, it really is the best of life. We're not missing anything. He says it not only robs a person's brain, but he says it can rob your wallet. Money, we've heard those stories of guys who get their paycheck, stop at the bar on their way. Usually these are paycheck to paycheck kind of experiences, and so they end up spending a whole chunk of their money on their endeavor in drinking alcohol, and so they don't have money at the end of that to buy food, provide clothes or housing, and we know those awful situations in which it robs from a family. There are a lot of families that simply don't know the niceties of life because those who are providing for them spend it on alcohol instead of taking care of their family. That is in the extreme, but it happens, and it happens far too frequently. A day's wage is lost also because of all the times that someone who becomes alcoholic, who they start getting sick and they can't work. He estimates that they could miss as much as half the time. Yale did a study in which they referred to the half man, someone who drinks enough and so frequently and so heavily that they are only productive of about half of what someone who doesn't do that is. And so he also talks about even on the job that those who have that lifestyle of drinking heavily are also involved in 48 of all the on-the-job accidents as well. France, he quotes a French study in which they estimated at that time nationally that they were losing 326 billion francs a year due to alcohol-related problems. And so it's just a colossal kind of problem. And so what does the Bible really say about it? The Bible does speak a lot about drunkenness. It speaks about the problems that are involved in it. the harm that it brings. It doesn't banish drinking any alcohol. You don't find that in the scriptures, but you do find the warning and the listing of drunkenness that is there, and it's saying don't do that. This is from Proverbs. It says, "Listen, my son," and this is giving advice from someone to a young guy who's in the midst of dealing with those problems. He hasn't really experienced it, so he doesn't know, looking for some advice. And this advice is given to him. "Listen, my son, and be wise. Direct your heart in the way. Do not be with heavy drinkers of wine or with gluttonous eaters of meat." Those two are paired together. "For the heavy drinker and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe one with rags." Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has the redness of eyes? Those who linger long over wine, and those who are tasting mixed wine. Do not look upon wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, that is, when it's attractive, when it goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like the viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things, and you will be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or like one who lies down on the top of the mast. You won't know what happened to you. When someone asks what's happened, you will say, "They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me, but I didn't even know it. What shall happen when I awake? Well, I guess I'll just seek for another drink." He who loves pleasure will become a poor man, and he who loves wine and oil will not become rich. Ephesians 5, the New Testament. "Do not become drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit." Luke 21, Jesus talking. "Be on guard, so that your hearts will not be weighed down with dissipation," same reference, "and drunkenness and the worries of life. And that day will not come upon you suddenly like a trap." Of course, it was Jesus who was accused of being a drunkard, where he did drink some, as opposed to John the Baptist, who drank none. Of course, they had problems against him. When Jesus said that, he was just saying, people just can't be satisfied. Whatever I do, they're going to see it as wrong, because they don't want to hear what God's call is on their lives. Yes, Jesus made wine at the wedding feast at his mom's request. And so there are some times where there is that aspect in the scriptures that says there's a place for it, but not for drunkenness, not for the inebriation of it, not for it becoming a part of your life in which it's ruining you and your enjoyment of life, ruining the people around you, causing harm to you, causing harm to the people around you. Now, there is a passage in the Bible in this discussion most preachers will never quote, and that's from Psalms 31. We usually go there close to Mother's Day because there's a large part of it that talk about the godly woman. But at the beginning of it, this proverb is given to King Lemuel by his mother. That was probably a way for him to say, hey, you're going to be becoming king, and you need to watch what you do. And she said to him, "It is not for kings to drink wine, or rulers to desire strong drink, for they will drink and they will forget what is decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted." We understand how that works. If someone is in charge of taking care of people, of administering justice, you don't want them to be the ones drinking, because justice won't happen. They won't remember what they are supposed to do. Alcohol has that impact, especially on leaders. But it says they will drink and forget what is decreed. They'll pervert the rights of the afflicted. But it says, "Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter." In other words, there is a place for it. Even this strong drink. There are people who at the end of their life, we call it hospice. How do you help them control the pain in those last days of life when there is no getting better? We would probably choose to use other forget his poverty and remember his troubles no more. Instead of opening your mouth for the bottle, you're to open your mouth for the mute, and you are to open your mouth for the rights of the unfortunate. You're to open your mouth to judge righteously and defend the rights of the afflicted and the needy. You know, there are things that when we open up, it pours in, and we just don't need that impact. I think if you're really looking to what is that God wants for me in my life, I would say we definitely fall down on that side of Ephesians 5 that I said earlier. He wants you to be filled with the Spirit. He wants you to be filled with that is going to hone your abilities, that is going to enhance your enjoyment in life, and that's going to move you to the opposite of what alcohol does. Rather than harming yourself and harming others, if you are filled with the Spirit, you are going to be helping and loving and supporting others in a dramatically different way. So that's it on the 5th chapter. We already know those lessons, but it's always a good reminder of knowing that whenever we follow God's ways, we're going to have none of these diseases. Good morning, and thank you.